Boston, we are learning. We're also following the latest developments surrounding a major political shakeup in Ethiopia. The country is located in the Horn of Africa. It's considered a key U.S. ally in the region when it comes to fighting terrorism. Ethiopia's prime minister abruptly resigned last week, creating more uncertainty and political chaos across the country. Here to take us through the latest is CBSN contributor Alex Kliment. He writes for Signal, a newsletter produced by GZero Media that includes this story and a list of different fascinating global articles every week. You can sign up for it at gzeromedia.com. Just head to the homepage and click subscribe to the newsletter. Alex, welcome.
Good to be here.
So this is a really fascinating story, and I think that for a lot of Americans, they sometimes sort of scratch their heads and say, why are we focusing so much on Ethiopia? But there is an ethnic rivalry happening in that country. The president is resigned, and that country's in turmoil. And why it's important is because it's one of the fastest growing economies in Africa.
It is indeed. This is one of the fastest growing economies in Africa. It's the second most populous country in Africa, and as you say, it is a key part of the counterterrorism strategy, particularly with respect to al-Qaeda affiliated militants in Somalia. It is also, however, a very repressive political system in Ethiopia, and as you mentioned, a very fractured, ethnically very fractured. And since 2015, both of those things have contributed to a massive protest movement. There are the two largest ethnic groups, the Oromo and the Amhara, feel that they've been shut out of political power by the ruling party. And there's been clashes between ethnic groups. At the same time, Ethiopians are frustrated at continued political repression, crackdown on human rights, crackdown on the media, imprisonment of political dissidents. And all of this really came to a head last week when the Prime Minister, Haile Mariam Desalegn, resigned. Now the country's in a state of emergency, and the question is, what happens next?
So Signal reported last month that a bunch of political prisoners were released, and it seemed like things were moving in the right direction. What happened?
Well, the Prime Minister, Haile Mariam, has actually been very weak the entire time he's been in power, since 2012. And this kind of ethnic tensions, he wasn't able to get ahead of that. And despite releasing the political prisoners, the demands from the various ethnic groups are still quite strong. The question is whether the ruling party decides to bring in someone who's more sort of capable of bringing people together, a more inclusive government, or doubles down under influence from the military and says, no, let's crack down even harder to solve this problem. They've been cracking down for 3 years. It hasn't worked. It's only gotten worse.
You know, that country is a sea of stability in an area of Africa that is unstable. South Sudan and Sudan border it, as does Somalia. We all know al-Shabaab is very active in Somalia. That is why it's so critical and such an important ally of the United States. What is the United States saying about what is happening?
Well, the United States says that the government needs to be more inclusive and more democratic. But the reality is that the United States has found it very useful to be allied with Ethiopia in the counterterrorism fight. There's an intelligence relationship with the Ethiopians that goes back the better part of 2 decades. And, you know, not an unfamiliar story in which backing for counterterrorism enables a government to crack down on its own citizens. So the United States is having this to kind of dance this dance again. Do we want stability in the name of counterterrorism, or do we want a more sort of democratic outcome that may undermine stability in the short term?
That's a fascinating discussion, and it's one that, for reasons that are probably too large to discuss in the short time that we have, the United States has done that in the past, whether it was for anti-communist regimes that were friendly to the United States and not friendly to the former Soviet Union, that we then allowed to fester and to empower brutal dictatorships just as long as they remained anti-communist, pro-democracy in quotes there. And now we're seeing the same thing. If you're a country that says we're fighting terror, we're on America's side when it comes to ISIS, but we don't bother us with what we're doing in our own countries.
Look, this is the, as long as they're our SOBs, school of foreign policy, right? The U.S. has done this throughout the Middle East in the second part of the 20th century and over the past 15 years. And as you say, there's this question of whether that stability is purchased at a price that actually foments more radicalism and more